Hello, my name is Luke George and I am having conversations with courageous educators. My guest today is Dr. Selena Fisk. She has a passion for educator and using data to improve outcomes for students and organisations. She is known as the data storyteller and is a sought-after conference speaker, author, and all-round sensational person making a difference. Welcome, Dr. Selena Fisk.
Well, thanks, Luke. Thanks for having me.
No worries, it's an absolute pleasure. I've been quite looking forward to this little conversation we're going to have today. So we usually start, where did you grow up, Selena? What was your family life like? What were those backgrounds that created the Selena Fisk that we know today?
Yeah, so I grew up in Brisbane. Originally, I was born on the Sunshine Coast, actually, so north of Brisbane, but then went to school in Brisbane and went to a state school and then to a Catholic high school. I guess what created Selena the educator? It's a good question because I guess I saw teachers. My dad was a swim coach my whole life. And then my mum was a primary school teacher and my grandma had been a primary school teacher as well. So I guess you could kind of say education was in my family. And I have no doubt that that absolutely influenced me and what I chose. To be honest, when I was in year 12 and I had to choose on my what was a QTAC form in Queensland at the time, we had to choose what courses we wanted to enroll in, and I actually couldn't think of anything, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to be. I had kind of other aspirations at different times, and nothing really stuck. And I just literally on the last day that form was due, I was like, oh, I'll just give teaching a crack and see what happens. And here we are, 20 years later, or more than that, 25 years later.
It sort of sounds like it's in your DNA, actually, Selena. Maybe it wasn't a choice. It just you were trying to in denial, but on the day when it came, it just happened to be teaching.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I had done in year 10 in the work experience week that we did, I did work experience in a primary school. And so I definitely had enjoyed that. And I'd obviously been in other primary schools a fair bit as a secondary school student. And I was like, look, it doesn't seem like the worst job in the world. I'll give it a go. And yeah, I obviously love it. And now I don't teach in a classroom. I obviously teach teachers, but I just love it. I love education.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good. One of the I suppose the best thing that I get in my life is to be able to speak to courageous educators like yourself and continue that passion that educators have. So it's a beautiful thing to keep inspiring people. Now you started in Brisbane. That's where your first teaching position came from. Is that right? And then whereabouts did you start? Were you primary school, secondary school? Where was your specialist when you first started teaching?
Yeah, so I'm secondary PE and maths trained. I loved PE at school. It was probably my strongest subject. And to be honest, when I enrolled in this course that I didn't really know whether I wanted to be in, I kind of thought, okay, well, I might choose phys ed and health ed. And it actually was somebody at uni in my orientation week, and they said, if you're trained in phys ed, health ed, you're really going to struggle to find a job. So, what other subject areas do you essentially not hate that you could choose? And I always liked maths. I was always pretty competent at maths. I didn't get exceptional results in maths, but I thought, oh, well, surely like I could do that. I'll give it a go. Then taught in a few different secondary schools in Queensland initially for about 18 months. And then I really, I guess, learned a lot when I moved to the UK. And so I was over there for just under 4 years. I was in the UK teaching as a secondary school teacher, and I was actually head of phys ed over there.
Right. So now I'm pretty sure that it's in the UK is when you started to get a bit of a taste for this data analysis space. Now, I'd say a few years ago when you first went there, data was most probably just coming into helping schools and teachers make decisions around education. What was your initial space that you got into? And then how did you progress it? And I suppose basically what captured your imagination of looking at data?
Yeah, it was really interesting, the experience over there, because I hadn't really learned how to use data at uni in my undergrad degree. I'd done my master's by that stage. There was no real kind of data specific subjects. And I went into a context in the UK where it was just kind of everywhere we went. So everybody spoke about it. The leaders spoke about it. And as a middle leader, there was a clear expectation on me to improve like improve the data, improve the pass rates and the success of students in my subject area. And in my faculty, we were running 4 different senior phys ed subjects. So we kind of had this priority to increase the improvement and increase pass rates. So in the UK, it was just a really interesting context where schools are, they get a few kind of overall rankings. They get the number of, or the percentage of students who get 5 pass grades, or 5 A star to C is what they call it. There's also a metric where it's the percentage of students who get 5 A star to C, including English and maths. And then there's also percentages around the percentage of students who get, A's and A stars, and then also the percentage of students who at least get 1 pass grade. So even just walking in with those expectations around me and my role was just a totally different context to having, taught prior to that in an all boys Catholic school in Brisbane. So it's pretty confronting. Like I guess I learned pretty quickly what was, well, I just kind of learned to play the game a little bit. I had to learn the curriculum really quickly. I had to learn how students were assessed. And I guess I'm really competitive and I'm competent with numbers. So I kind of thought, well, what I can predict is I can do formative assessments. I can collect good data on where my students are at, and I can use that to predict where they're going to kind of end up at the end of the course, as opposed to, just hoping that they would do well or hoping that they would achieve their goals. And that was really where it started for me. And then I guess what I saw and what I experienced was a really positive engagement with students. So 15, 16-year-old kids they were actually kind of tweaking my spreadsheet. We were working together to talk about their goals, aspirations, and then tweak the different bits of data. So kids were kind of saying to me, well, if I was able to improve this component of the subject, would that get me over the next threshold into the next grade boundary? Or what if I got better at this, and how much would I need to get better to have the same impact? And to be honest, that's kind of where my love of this really started, because they were so engaged, they were so bought into the process, and we were removing a lot of the guesswork that had been happening, I guess. And so they knew what results they needed going into the final exams, and all of that to be able to achieve the aim, like the grades that they had set themselves and the targets they'd set. On the flip side, I guess I saw some really negative uses of data. So there was culturally, there was a lot of fear around, like, what if you don't hit the targets in your department? And people were performance managed if they weren't doing very well. So there was a really negative use of data as well. And I guess I talk about both of those when I do my work now. I talk about the good and the bad, and how we need to lean into the really powerful, useful information that ultimately benefits young people. And we need to push back against those things that are, I guess, attached to accountability and performance management and performance-based pay and all of that, because it's not fair. And it's also not why we do what we do. It's not why we became teachers.
Correct.
In the first place.
So there's a couple of things there. Was it a case when you first went over there, when you're looking at like strategies and play the game, of what we measure is what we manage? So if we're going to measure this amount of data, then I'll manage and put some effort into that. Is there a risk that teachers and educators go to where the results need to be and maybe miss some of the other things that we also need to be doing that could add to those results, but because they're not measured, we sort of don't put as much effort into it? Is there a balance that we also need to do in that space?
Yeah, completely. And the context in the UK when I was there, was very learning analytics related. And then when I came home to Australia, I didn't notice much use of data in the schools I went into, and then that's increased over time. But I guess, as you say, it's because we prioritize those outcomes in senior subjects, and as a secondary teacher, it's external results at the end of year 12. Absolutely, because they're the things we value and we market to families and to communities. They're the things that absolutely get measured. And when I first started in this role, particularly, or these types of roles in Australia, it was almost like teachers, classroom teachers and curriculum leaders, for example, or heads of literacy or numeracy, they cared exclusively about learning analytics. And it was almost the pastoral leaders or the dean of students or the house leaders or, year level coordinators. They cared about the attendance and wellbeing information and behaviour data. And it was quite separate and quite siloed. Whereas now what we've seen, and particularly through the pandemic, there's been just a huge explosion in the amount of wellbeing data that we collect, which is awesome. But the better outcome of all of that focus on student wellbeing is that we're now more than ever seeing students collectively as a whole person. And we're saying, actually, as a classroom teacher, I want to know, is that young person coming to school? Are they feeling like they're ready to learn? Are they tracking well? Like, do they feel well? And if not, we know obviously that that's going to absolutely impact their academic outcomes. So it's definitely getting better. And some visualization dashboards are starting to do that type of thing really well and starting to bring the learning analytics in alongside some of the other information. I guess the shift I see now as being the next step, and kind of going to your point about, are we just measuring the things that matter? With the whole discussions around graduate portfolios, I see in my work that a lot of schools are heading down the path of trying to measure, for lack of a better word, or trying to grade, for lack of a better word, learner dispositions or characteristics. So there's a whole project coming out of Melbourne Uni called the New Metrics program or project. That's one example, but there are plenty of schools that are not in that project that are trying to do this themselves. So how are we giving students feedback on their ability to collaborate and how curious they are and how engaged they are in their learning? And so that for me is what I'm seeing as a really kind of big next step and next opportunity in the data that we're collecting.
Yeah. And that last little piece that you're talking about, are children curious? Are they collaborative? It really comes back to your early days in the UK where you are working with the children. They got excited about looking at the data and looking about how they were growing and what they were doing. And suppose it's that space of, well, it doesn't really matter what data they're looking at, so long as they're looking at data, and then we can feed them all of this other information that's available so then they can get a real awesome awareness of what's possible. So if I was a bit more collaborative, if I was a bit more kind, so it doesn't necessarily have to come back to if I know more trigonometry, it's actually I could improve the inner self, can actually get me there as well, rather than just reading more books, for instance. So that's that whole child space that you're looking into, and I suppose getting a bit excited about, because it's been lacking over a period of time, and it's great that it's now coming to the forefront.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing that I would add in that is, while we work with students to set goals, I think we're getting better at using tangible data to inform those goals that students are setting for themselves. And I think collectively, what I'm seeing are far better goal setting examples where students are, it's the whole idea of having an outcome goal versus a process goal. So aiming for a B in a subject area is an outcome goal. But actually, we need to connect that aspiration, that learning analytics, to the behaviours and the habits and the actions that they're engaging with every single day to see that translation into the learning analytics. Like the learning analytics result that's the last point, really. It's about the shift in behaviours and dispositions along the way.
So so to sort of simplify what you were just saying in my simple terms, is by having the behaviour goals is actually saying, well, if I need to do X amount of work in a particular subject, and I need to do, say, 10 minutes each day for 5 days, that's obviously going to progress me there. So the behavior there is building a habit to do that. But if I'm not even doing that, if I'm not measuring it, so last week I did 0, the expectation that I'm going to get the B outcome isn't going to happen. So we can actually, using that data that's starting to come out, is actually analyze the behavior rather than the actual knowledge content in regards to the end outcome. So this is now getting, and then it comes back to, like anything, you make a decision. You know what? This is all I've got to do is do those couple of steps, and I'll get the B. Otherwise, it's just a dream. It's a maybe, rather than it's an actual process that can get you there. So it's lovely that we're looking at both sides of that story.
Yeah, it's also having more tangible information about those habits that doesn't, that's I guess it's harder, it's more objective, it's useful. Like, you think about, if you want to improve your strength in the gym, you could just rock up to the gym each day and do whatever you feel like doing at the time, and, kind of guess your way around the next weight that you should be doing or how many reps. but it's you get to see your progress more if you're actually recording those things and you plan out your actions and the incremental changes that you're going to be making each time you go to the gym. And then it's also really rewarding because by the end of it, you can kind of see back to where you were at the beginning of your 6-week plan. And, you know, you might be lifting twice as much now, whatever it is. And it's on paper as opposed to, we often forget where we came from if we haven't kind of planned out those actions and behaviors and written them down, and we don't have records. We often forget where we came from. So yeah, it's just a good way of making that really tangible and obvious.
Yeah, I like it. I like it. Especially when we put the goal out in front of us and there's no real metric to be able to get there. And what you were just talking about is actually having successes by doing those small weights. That's a success. I haven't got the big weights, but
Absolutely.
it's just getting the little successes and moving across. And James Clear talks about that in Atomic Habits. Always those little 1%ers, step after step, rather than just saying, you know, let's get the B and it's going to be in a year's time. Let's measure those little points moving across. So, Selena, what was, you're a doctor. You're obviously not a doctor of medicine. You're are you a doctor of data? Would that be, is that what we call yourselves? And what was the actual doctorate that you actually worked on a few years ago?
One of my friends calls me a doctor of data, but it's not technically correct. Doctor of education. So my doctorate was in student perceptions of feedback. So I interviewed students in a couple of schools. So my original plan was to compare the use of data in Australia with the UK, and I was told pretty quickly that was too big a mountain to try to climb. So I shifted it, and as all theses do, they change. And so mine became about what type of feedback are we giving to students? What's the data that we're giving back to them? What do they value? What do they find useful? And yeah, it was just really interesting. I interviewed 30 students and about 12 teachers across 3 sites. And I just saw really kind of consistent trends across all of them, which was fascinating.
Which were, could you reveal those trends from that doctorate? What did we find?
Don't go and read the document. Trust me. It's too big.
So what could be the
So
executive
there were
summary
things
then?
like, yeah, so the executive summary, and this was obviously a few years ago, right? Like I graduated in 2017, so things have changed a little bit. But I interviewed students in an all girls and all boys and a co-ed context, and in a department or state school, in an independent school that was Anglican, and in a Catholic school. And so it's just fascinating to me that I saw really consistent messages being shared by students across them. I found out things like students actually obviously really wanted to know their grade, but they really wanted to know where they sat in their cohort. And almost all of my students, bar one, said, actually, I want to know where I sit and whether or not my result was high, middle, or low, because it helps me understand a bit more about my own achievement. There was one student in my study who didn't want to know. And it was really fascinating because an assumption I hear, or something I hear from teachers often, is what about those students who are lower performing and ones that really struggle? And interestingly, the one person who flagged it as something she didn't want was a student who achieves ducks she was the ducks of a couple of her year 12 subjects. And she said, I actually don't care all that much if I get ducks of this subject, but my best friend really, really wants it. And every time they compare us, I feel bad because it doesn't matter all that much to me. So it's really interesting. It almost kind of flipped some of those assumptions on their head. And the teachers I spoke to reiterated, I guess, the things that we think about all the time. So that whole fear, like, what if a student is low when they didn't know that, and then we share it, and how are they going to feel? There's real concern about students. And students kind of were saying to me, well, if we're low, we know where we're at. But it just gives us a bit more context. So that was one of them. Another kind of key finding was around the way we give feedback, so the mode. So students were saying that their preferred type of feedback is written and handwritten at the time over electronic, just because of where, like if you edit, say, a Microsoft Word document, all the it kind of can move the formatting around, and comments can kind of fall off the page onto the next. And students were saying, look, it just actually makes it more difficult. But they also requested or preferred the opportunity to go and have a conversation with the teacher after the feedback. But then equally, I had really intuitive kids saying to me, I don't want to ask for feedback verbally. I don't want to go and ask for them to help me because they've put in all this work and effort to mark my work in the first place. So I feel like they've done enough. So I feel bad asking. But that certainly came out as a written feedback followed up by verbal.
Right.
Yeah.
Just as you were speaking there, I was thinking about that student that we'll call the duck student, and for a rightly so, you know, her friend wants to be ducks and not to be sharing that space. Does it come down to giving students choice, like it's part of nearly like having your photo? Do you mind having your photos taken? Yes or no? So we don't do it. Would you like to use this data? And given a more than just, you know, would you like to use data to be able to help you understand what your journey is? Give it some more context. But then students can say a yes or no, or should it be a state of everyone needs it and you just got to live with it? What would be your thoughts around that space?
Yeah, it's hard. I'm not sure I have a hard and fast rule around it because it can be done really badly, and we need to be obviously really mindful of how we share the information with students and how we lead them into those conversations and lead them through the conversations. I've seen it done really, really well. And I've seen whole schools really embrace their use of data. So students have got access to their own visualization dashboards, parents have got access to it, and it's just part of what they do. And they appreciate it. They value the information, and parents just love being able to kind of log in and be able to see changes in, you know, different assessment types and get more information about how their student or how their child is going. So it can be done really well. In saying that, particularly in the early days, it's really worth thinking about, like, how do you seek permission from students and how do you share with them the benefits and show them what would potentially be shared. There's just, in my data informed learners book, I go into a bit around like how to have that conversation and lead into it beforehand, and then what to do during the conversation. But yeah, you've obviously got to think about your audience completely and make good decisions for them. Because
good point.
Yeah, we don't want obviously to do the wrong thing for them.
Yep, I like it. Yeah, let's get some information around it. Let's just not blurt into it. Let's work through all the possible scenarios and get those strong conversations happening so people will feel very informed, and also that they can take their time. And then by the sounds of things, if you do enough of that, you can get a whole school culture where it's just an accepted form. So I'm hearing there that it takes a bit of time. Yeah. And I know that some of your workshops you do is about how to inform and how to use data to inform people, which brings me to the space that you work in. You have a three-pronged attack when you're looking at data and working with schools. What's the sort of model look like? And I think the first one starts with just data literacy. It would be the first component. Can you tell us a little bit about what data literacy looks like?
Yeah, so there's kind of the three circles in my model, and I do work in all three spaces, but mostly in the data storytelling space, which is the third one. So data literacy is the first, and it's like we need to understand the metrics that we have. We need to understand the numbers that are in the spreadsheet. We need to understand the context of them, because we can't actually do anything with the data. We can't use it to inform our teaching practice. We can't use it in conversations with students. We can't use it to better, you know, their outcomes if we don't actually understand it in the first place. And I have a data diagnostic survey, and I've had about 5,000 people do that survey now. And it's really interesting where teachers often tell me in that data diagnostic that they need more time and more support because they don't feel like their data literacy skills are as good as they could be or should be. So yeah, it's a big gap. And as I say, we can't actually expect people to use it until they understand those things.
Because I suppose we'd all just presume that we all know what numbers look like. I mean, there they are. It can't be that difficult, but it is difficult because what's the behaviour? What are the attitudes and the understandings behind that data, and the person that's in there as well? And then we get a better space, which I suppose brings us into that visualisation. What does it look like as a bigger picture? Is that what the data visualisation being the second circle that you look at?
Yeah, the data visualization is the second one, and it does help with the data literacy because visualizations help make the trends visible. It's where we use color coding, heat maps. We use different graphs and charts to represent what's kind of going on for the student or for the cohort or for the whole school in some instances. It does help with the data literacy. So part of the data literacy is also, just even understanding in your context, in your school, is that particular metric good or bad? A 70% attendance, for example, in some school contexts in Australia would be classified as being a really good attendance. And in other school systems and schools across the country, it would be really low, and there would be some significant kind of interventions being put in place to support students at that level of attendance. So it's kind of it's not just about the number and understanding what a percentage is. It's more so, or it's also about how does that. It's the meaning making piece. It's the what does it actually mean for me in my context and for my students. And the visualizations do help that, because they allow us to start to see the bits that are higher and lower, and students who might be really struggling.
So let's finish off to where we started, I suppose, as the introduction, as you are the data storyteller. And I know you love this little space. And I'm loving that you actually use data as a story, because we don't necessarily look at it like that. A lot of numbers, a lot of figures and facts, not a lot of emotion in it. And yet you pride yourself in getting people to actually be data storytellers. This is a next leap for you. So tell us what this looks like and why it's important to actually allow the data to tell a story.
Yeah, well, obviously, every metric that we're looking at, any bit of data we have is a representation of a human being, and it's humans in our schools that are generating this information and the data for us. We as humans are the ones that are doing the work with it, and then ideally and ultimately it should be benefiting human beings on the other side of all of that work. And I guess, unfortunately, and this is, I think it's a legacy of our education system, to be honest. It's, I know for a fact that, like, I grew up as the math science kid. So it was almost like I did math science. I knew I was pretty good at it. I knew that I was not very good at English and humanities. So I had a really strong identity early on that I was the math science kid and I wasn't a words person, and vice versa. So we kind of have these two lanes happening in our schools where the two aren't really merged. And that's why I think, there's a gap and there's a lot of opportunity to learn more, because it's not one or the other. It's actually about this beautiful overlap of the human experience and our backgrounds and all of that, and what we know about our young people, to think about, well, what's most likely to work best for them. Like, we're not dealing with machines. We're dealing with complex human beings, complex systems. It's never going to be as simple as saying, this is a metric I have, I'm just going to make this change to my practice, and therefore everything's going to be magically better on the other end, and everybody's going to get an A or whatever it might be. And so we, being data storytellers, we go into those conversations, I guess, with more grace for ourselves and for it not having to be perfect, but also, respect and acknowledgement of the young people that we're ultimately there to serve. So one of the things I often say is it's about the numbers, but it's not about the numbers, because at the end of the day, it's what are we actually doing for young people, and how are they better off for the work that we do? Because if they're not benefiting from it, then I reckon it's a complete waste of our time.
Absolutely. That's interesting. You say that you're a math science kid, and you're not quite wordy, yet you're quite the author, and you've written a few data books. And you've just released one not long ago. Would that be correct? Or what was your latest one that you've now got out there on the market, which is just as important?
Yeah, that was the one last year was Data Informed Learners. So that's the most recent one. It's funny, I actually often use that now because people say to me all the time, I'm not a numbers person, which is why I named one of my books that. But my comeback now is, well, I always used to think I was not a words person, and I've written a couple of books. So if I can learn and get better, you can learn how to use numbers a little bit better than you were before, or you could before. So yeah, we can all learn, right? We can all make progress.
Absolutely. And I do recommend that to listeners, and you'll get the links to Selena's website. Have a look at her books. They're absolutely magnificent, easy to read, and they really do set out all of the things that she's just been talking about in regards to data literacy, data visualization, data storytelling. So it's a and also it's hands-on. It's exactly what we need in the classroom. So our next little piece is, I'm interested whether there was any quotes that you use in your life that help inspire you, keep you moving along, or do you just sort of wander through life? I doubt you would be that sort of person. I reckon you've got a few mantras that you might use to keep you motivated. Have you got anything that keeps you grounded there, Selena, that you would like to share?
Yeah, I'm going to get this one wrong, but it's the whole, do the best with what you have, and then when you know better, do better. And I think that applies in our personal lives and our professional lives. And I work with lots of people who are really well-intentioned, doing amazing things. And then, we learn more and we tweak what we do, and it's even better. It doesn't mean that what we used to do was rubbish. If we were doing the best with the best we could with what we had at the time, then that's enough, right? So it's that kind of incremental step forward. We've always got room to move. We've always got opportunity to learn and progress. And yeah, I just value that kind of ongoing learning and evolution because I reckon change is rad. And I love this dynamic world we live in where, days are not the same. Things change all the time. Like, yeah, I think if we stayed static and stagnant, it'd be pretty boring.
I like that part about your quote about sort of we give ourselves a bit of well, why were we doing that? We should have been doing it better. Why didn't I know? And yet what you were doing was as good as you had at the time. And going back to data, this is what the data was telling you. These are the conversations you were having. But it takes a bit of courage then to say, well, could it be better? Could I expand? Could I grow? And then you come up that level. But it's not to say that what you were just doing wasn't just as good as well. So let's not be hard on ourselves. Let's be appreciative of ourselves to allow us to then take that next step and allow us to actually look back and be able to say, wow, look at me now, and keep doing that change.
Totally. And I get to work with so many good people across the country. And I genuinely say, hand on heart, I reckon 99% of the people that we work with and we have in our schools are really well-intentioned, want the best outcomes for our kids. Like it's virtually every person I come into contact with, they are doing their best with what they have. And so, yeah, we need to celebrate and recognize that because they're working very, very hard.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. It's interesting that, when we're working with teachers, that sometimes they feel as if they're not doing their best. And teachers are so giving, they just want to give their all. And they think, I could give more. But there's only so much time. But it's just the beauty about that they do give and they recognize that. And they still have that energy to get up every day and come and do it again. And they know about progressing students, and the data actually helps them. So what would be three comments that you could give to schools, to teachers, to educators, that they could come away from this podcast and say, oh, I'm going to try those three things. I'm going to just tweak what I'm currently doing. Would there be three easy, memorable suggestions that you could give us, Selena?
Yeah, so kind of just on that theme, actually, the first one would be data actually has the potential to show us a lot about growth that students are making and progress. And so whenever we do that, we need 2 data points, and the conversation is about the journey or the change that has taken place rather than just the current result. And so that could be a change in wellbeing scores, it could be a change in learner dispositions, in A to E results, whatever it might be, but it's a real change in a conversation around the growth. And I just love it because as we've just said, I believe everybody's got the capacity to improve. And it also doesn't matter where the young person started. So some of our our biggest amounts of growth happen for students who are really struggling. So data gives us an awesome opportunity to see that and to show them. The second one then tied into that would be around celebrating. Sometimes there's an assumption that when we look at data, we only do it from a deficit model. We're only looking for the problems or the gaps or things that need fixing. There is so much awesome stuff in our data, kids that have done really well, students who have got their personal best, kids who've turned things around and they're coming to school more, or their behaviour incidences have dropped significantly. We've got to lean into the data in the same way that we look for gaps and actually look for those areas of celebration and opportunities for, just bigging up kids and making a big deal of them and recognising when they do awesome things. And the final one would be, I always talk about triangulation. So we never want to just use one data set to make decisions. every data set has noise and bias in it. Like no data set's perfect, right? We know that. But when we can look at 3 or more data sets together, and if we can see a trend or an insight appearing across multiple sets, then we just know more definitively that what we're seeing is accurate, and that's an accurate kind of trend or insight. So yeah, they're probably my 3: progress, celebrating with kids, and always using multiple sources of information to make decisions.
Wow. And we can do that. Like, they're very doable. And I like the way that we can focus in on some of those things. Where's your starting point? I love the idea of having a conversation that it's just not a number. It's about, hey, but you were here and now you're here. And that can be both celebratory, which would be the second part, but there's also let's look at the reason why it didn't maybe progress as fast or as sharp as we would like. So it's always about a point rather than right at this very point, you're right here. Let's give us that journey. Loving that. Also the celebrations. I agree 100%. We should celebrate the small things yet again. Every day we can celebrate something. We progressed. And then that triangulation, never in isolation, never as a solo. What would you're a pretty busy person. I know you're all around Australia doing all sorts of things, speaking and helping schools, etc. How do you manage that professional and personal energy that you have, Selena? Is there a place where you can actually turn off? Is there a happy place you go to, or do you just love your profession so much it's just all good fun, or do you actually find a balance?
I've had a couple of people in the last few years ask me what do I do for fun, because they're like, do you stop? I'm like, yes, I stop, and I stop very well. No, I'm deliberate about carving out that time and space. Like, I can't deliver to audiences 5 days a week, for example. So I'm really conscious about not doing that. So I make ideally some boundary decisions around my calendar. It doesn't always work perfectly, but most of the time it does. But for me, I've got 2 dogs. We live not too far from a dog beach, so I spend a lot of time down there. I hope I haven't said the B word too loudly. I didn't get a reaction from the one behind me. They usually get very excited.
That's what they used to do the same.
Just being out. Yeah. They're the best. And just being out, I live, in Moreton Bay. It's just beautiful Queensland weather. Like, even in winter, it's just stunning. So love doing that. And just doing things that light me up and things that make me happy. Like, I love an infrared sauna. I love a reformer Pilates class, and I just really value the people that I have around me. So actively make time to be with them and spend good quality time with them.
Yeah, I like that. I like that touch on that you said about boundaries and making decisions around those boundaries. And then you went on to tell us about how those boundaries are, great people, a sauna, the dogs. Because I think we forget that part. Once again, as a teacher, you want to give more. Have I done enough? Is there something else? And having those boundaries in your life is so important. Now,
I think one of the things I often say about teaching is, and it's like owning your own business now, right? And I'm sure you're in a similar position. Teaching never stops. Like, you never get to a point at the end of the day and go, yeah, great, I've done everything I need to do. There's nothing else needed, and I'll just show up tomorrow and I'll work out what the next step is. Like, there is always a massive to-do list. And particularly when I was doing my doctorate, and I was still working full time, I just set some really clear boundaries around what I didn't do to just kind of keep myself sane, to be honest, just to kind of keep school in my school lane and uni in my uni lane. And so for me, one of my boundaries for that was, if I need to work on school related stuff, I stay at school. And so I didn't take any school work home, and I worked on uni work at home. And it was just the way that my brain needed to compartmentalize one or the other. And I would, even on a weekend, I'd rock up at school if I needed to do stuff, which I don't recommend. But for me, it was just the way I kind of needed to manage it. Because otherwise you just keep going, right? You just don't stop, because you never get to that point where you feel like you've finished everything and you've got nothing else to do.
Yeah. It's like having the office at home, isn't it? Like, you actually go there, and you can go there so easily when you're in business for yourself, and you do have to have that blocker going, no, you don't need to go in there, deliberately go and do something else. Selena, how do people get in touch with you if they want to speak to you, look at because I know you've got a great podcast out there now. You've written some fantastic books. You're speaking in different places. how do they get in contact with you? And we'll make sure that they're part of the notes underneath.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks. My website's selenafisk.com. And all my information about like my Data Champions program is my biggest one that I run, all my speaking kind of like different keynote topics and that sort of thing. It's all on there. You'll also be able to find links to my podcast, Make Data Talk, which is available on all your normal kind of podcasting platforms. And I also have a newsletter on LinkedIn that goes out weekly. So lots of ways we can stay connected if you're into learning more and hearing more about data.
I love hearing about data. And the last one I always like, and some people feel a bit uncomfortable, but what would you say to your 20-year-old self, Selena? Did you have any advice for them? What was something that may be there, or maybe it's just live life as it is? But if you had that opportunity, what do you reckon?
Yeah, it's such a hard question, isn't it? And I have prided myself for a really long time on saying I don't regret anything. You know, the decisions I've made have all contributed to what I do now, right? And where I'm at now. I don't know. I would probably say, you know, dream big. Like I didn't really know what I wanted to do at the time. I wasn't sure whether education was the right thing for me. It's turned out to be awesome and I love it. And I do miss being in the classroom. But I probably wasn't encouraged to think big enough about what was truly possible, so I knew definitively what I wanted to do. So, yeah, it's probably what it would be, I think.
Well, you've certainly dreamt big, and you are very big in that space on being that data storyteller. It has been an absolute pleasure speaking with you, Dr. Selena Fisk, and we thank you for your time and expertise, and I'll have a chat to you another time in another place. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Luke. It was lovely chatting.